Hi there. In this video, I will cover 10 tips on how to optimize your workload units and get the best value for your Bubble subscription. On 1st October 2024, all of Bubble apps will switch over to using the workload unit billing model. Nothing to worry about, as we can optimize a lot using these 10 tips. And if you stick around till the end, there is a bonus 11th one as well. Now, before we begin, if you don't know what workload units are, I've got a video on it linked in the description below. In a nutshell, workload units are your new currency. Depending on your plan, you get a certain amount of workload units every month. Doing anything in the app will use up workload units, whether it's a page load, an API call, a database change, a workflow, anything and everything uses workload units. Now let's get started. So tip number one that I have for you is to avoid nested searches. All right. What do I mean by nested searches? If you've got a repeating group and you search for, let's say, messages, and inside that, you're also doing another search inside. This is a nested search. Okay. This is one example of a nested search in the data source. You can also be like putting another nested search here. This is called a nested search, and you should do your best to avoid nested searches. Now in this particular example, instead of like doing a nested search, what you can do is that you can add a particular database field in your table and you can just filter that by default so that you only make one API call and get the relevant data in your front end only. And there are other tricks that I cover in tip number 5 and 6. All right. So the next one is auto binding versus saving once. Now, auto binding is a very powerful feature in Bubble. We used to use it a lot. However, if you think about it, every time you auto bind a particular input, it's doing a particular database operation, and we don't want that. Every time I do a database operation, I'm consuming more workload units. Whereas in a different setting, if I just had one save button and I click once, I just had one database operation and all of my inputs change. Now, if you multiply this by 10 form fields and a sequence of forms, it's just gonna scale up and up. If you're finding this video helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could smash that like button for the algorithm. All right, so tip number 3 is to avoid advanced filters. What do I mean by advanced filters? If you've got a particular repeating group, you do a search, you place this filter here, you do an advanced filter and do some special conditional operations here. This is an advanced filter. What it does is that it fetches all the data into the front end, and then it starts filtering it in the front end in the user's browser itself. Now that heavy fetch, let's say you had 100 users, you fetch them all in the front end, that's just a waste of workload units. And then you filter them in the front end, that will be slow as well. Now, what are the alternatives? You can set up your database architecture in a better manner, add some extra fields, add some tags or option sets, and just constrain the search from the very beginning itself. All right, you don't have to use, there are very limited scenarios where we have to end up using advanced filters. And even if you do, the best thing is to constrain this first part of the search as much as possible. And if you're only fetching like, I don't know, 5-10 items in the front end in using an advanced filter, that's okay. It's not that big of a deal. It can sometimes, especially when comparing lists with lists. I've got a separate video on that. I think advanced filters are the only way, as far as I'm aware, to easily do those. Now, tip number 4. Don't accidentally ignore empty constraints. Now, this is a very subtle one. What do I mean by ignore empty constraints? If I do a search and I tick this box, ignore empty constraints, what happens is that if this this state is empty, then everything will be fetched. Now, here's the subtle detail. This state is set on when page loaded, set state, current project, something is set here. So what happens? For a brief moment in time on page load, this is empty, and this ignore empty constraint search happens. So all of the messages are fetched, and then this constraint is applied on page load, and then the next fetch happens. So you just had 2 fetches for no reason whatsoever. You can use conditionals, you can use other ways. Now, it is also a useful feature, so it's a bit tricky to just completely ignore it, but there are ways to use conditionals perhaps to kind of not load the data source at all until the condition is valid. Now, what can you do in this situation? You can not use the data source by default. You can place a conditional that I'll only do it when my state is valid. Then I'll change the data source property or some other mechanism, but be very careful about these hidden ways that in which you can basically leak workload units. All right. I plan on making more of these videos to cover workload unit optimization, and they take a lot of time to prepare and make. So I'd love to thank you for subscribing to this channel and keeping me motivated. Alright, so tip number 5, shorter lists can sometimes be faster than searches. Alright, what do I mean by shorter list? Let's say we have a project with a list of invoices inside it. The usual thing that we would use to do is search for invoice, related project, is this project, just show this list altogether. Now let's say we have a project with, I don't know, 5-10 installments and nothing heavy. For those scenarios, it's better in terms of workload units to just have a list of invoices field that you maintain in the project, so that anytime you fetch it, you don't do a search itself. When you get the project, you already have the list of invoices. This is only good for like up to 30 elements in the list. Anything more and a separate table is probably good. I personally like using separate tables in some aspects because of just to manage it, and lists are, I'll be honest, not my favorite. But when it comes to workload units, in certain situations, lists can be more efficient as well. And another aspect of this is to avoid longer lists in your objects, because every time an object is loaded, let's say this project had 200 invoices. Every time the project is loaded, all 200 will load in the front end. That'll be unnecessarily heavy. So definitely avoid longer lists. Now, number 6 is to hide elements by default. So Bubble has some caching mechanisms that on page load, it will only fetch what it needs to fetch. And if you've got groups that are not visible on page load and only visible when there's a certain condition, that's better. Now these tips might seem small, but in our Bubble world for our clients, we have found that it is usually death by 1,000 little cuts rather than one big thing eating up all the units. All right. Number 7, another simple one is the ordering of conditions. Now, conditions are evaluated left to right, all right? And if you've got a fairly common scenario is that you've got a certain set of conditions and that tweaks something. Now, keep the simplest condition on the left and then go towards the most complicated, most heavy one on the right. So in this case, if group project is not visible, the rest of the condition will not evaluate. So this search won't run. Whereas if I had the search in the beginning and the search did a fetch, and then something happened, and at the very end the group project was not visible, or the search was just completely useless, unnecessary waste of workload. Now for some advanced stuff. Tip number 8 is variables. All right, so it's a general principle that you try and fetch once and reuse it in various places. How can you use states? Is custom states in Bubble are like a type of variable, but sometimes you need some things in the editor as well. You don't have to run workflow actions to get those variables ready and states ready. So what you can do is you just make a particular type of group and add the group's data source, and then you can use this group itself later on as a data source. Okay, and this group can be 1 pixel by 1 pixel placed in a hidden pop-up, like Canvas, the framework does it a lot. There's lots of hidden variables and pop-ups that you can just use them like that. And once you have those variables, you can easily then use this group or repeating group depending on what you've done and how you've like what variable. If you want to save a list of things, just place a hidden repeating group. If you want to save a single item, just place a single group. All right. Now, if you want to access this later on, you can simply access it in other groups like var rgs, like the group's data. So I'm just accessing that group's data source. If I want to display a count, instead of doing a new do a search for invoices count, which will be heavy, I'll just fetch that variable and I'll do a particular count. Okay. If I'm doing some type of filtering or statuses, I can fetch that variable and I can do this front end operation on the client side. It's way more efficient when it comes to workload units compared to do a search count, do a search show it here, do a search show the number of pages left, too many searches, unnecessary waste of workload unit. Now, tip number 9 is to take a look at the Chrome Inspect console. Chrome, Safari, Firefox, all of them have Inspect consoles, developer consoles. Nothing to be too scared about, but in Chrome, you can get this open when you click, I think, the F12 key on Windows, but there will be a particular way if you're using Mac or some other browsers, or you can right click. I don't think you see it in the recording, but in my right click view, I do see a Chrome Inspect console. Now, once in the Inspect console, one of the things to take a look is how many elements am I loading? And that you can get by this simple command. Let me just try and move this over 1 second. Okay. So document.get elements by tag name asterisk.length. So we are loading 217 elements for this particular test page. If I open the ASCII Tech Labs bubble.io agency page and I run the same command, it's 753 HTML elements. So just as a general, okay, so just in terms of number of elements loaded is 3 times number of elements loaded. This page load will be a bit more heavy, slower and heavier. Sometimes it's needed. Sometimes this, if that was 7,000, it's like, oh, did we just make some random mistake here? Are there some hidden groups which are not hidden? What's going on here? Let's take a look. The next tab to take a look is the network tab. All right. So this can be a bit confusing if you've not tuned it a little bit. So the thing I like to do once the tab's open is I long press the refresh icon. It's not visible in the video, but you can see empty cache and hard reload here. Once I do an empty cache hard reload, it does a clean fetch of the entire page. And this is everything that's being downloaded. The app, the infrastructure, the data fetch, everything is coming through here. Now, this is a bit hard to parse and understand, but if you filter it by this fetch/xhr, these are all the fetches that happened. Now this is a bit of a complicated page, so I'll switch over to my simpler test page so that we can just take a look at what came through, what sort of fetches. It's easier to do fetches and smaller just test pages and see what happened. So if I open this M search, it's fetching, what is it fetching? It's fetching the users here. Yeah. mi@abc.com. It's just fetching the whole user table. One of these repeating groups in the test was a user one. Search. This one's fetching messages. Okay, you slowly start realizing and understanding this. This is searching custom invoices. So all of these, they all add up. You can take a look at their sizes. That, oh, this is a kilobyte, 2 kilobytes. On a real page, it will probably be much more. It will be like, okay, 30 kilobytes this, 13 here, more. You can sort them by weight as well. And you're like, okay, what is this particular search happening? Okay, what is this particular search happening and why is it happening? So, and then you can just dive a bit deeper into what's happening. AirDev have a lovely detailed guide on how to take a look at the Chrome Inspect console. And I'll be honest, a lot of the tips covered here are basically from AirDev's manual. AirDev's. Tip number 10 is around API calls. Now, an API call, people don't realize that much that an API call can sometimes return a lot of unnecessary data. So I'll just use the OpenAI Assistance API, which I've made a very detailed tutorial recently. And we've done many projects using OpenAI. So in the Assistance API, there are threads and there are messages. So if I'm getting a list of messages, I'll just make a get a list of messages API call, and it'll return all the messages in the thread all by itself. And I'm like, okay, fine, I'll just get list of messages. I'm picking first item. I'll just run with it. Now what happened is in terms of Bubble server and workload unit, it still got like a long series of threads and messages for no particular reason. All I had to do was check the API reference docs, see if there's some pagination. There's almost always limit, pagination, page, something around those lines. So in this case, it has limit. So I'm just gonna add a limit to my API call. Limit 1, I just want the latest message, order it by descending. I was like, initialize this call. The call itself will run faster. So it's faster and workload unit efficient. Okay, so I'm just getting, see this response is just one particular response. And even if you take just a rough look, 1001, okay, so this is taking a second to fetch everything back. If I take this look, 1001, this one just feels a bit faster because it's fetching less data. It's just fetching faster, workload unit efficient as well. Bonus tip number 11. Mindset. Now, to squeeze as much as you need from Bubble, you need to think a little bit more like a software engineer or a developer. Understand the fundamentals of what is going on behind the scenes. there's a server in the cloud doing some things, there's a database, there's API calls, there's a front end, that's the page load, there's the user's browser action. Understanding a little bit about the fundamentals and just thinking and having a perspective of like, I'm gonna test something, I'm gonna check the logs. The logs are very handy now. You can just go to logs, server logs, and check, okay, what did this run? What did this action take? What did this action take? Oh, email is a bit heavy with this plugin. Oh, make changes to list of things. This is taking too much workflow action. This particular workflow using. So just check the logs, test, think, and iterate and tune where you can. As I mentioned, we've done work with our bubble agency for clients. It's usually death by 1,000 cuts. It's rarely, oh, that one naughty workflow is just eating it all up. We'll just remove that, or we'll just tune that one and we're sorted. It's usually death by 1,000 cuts. Now, if there is something you'd specifically like me to cover in a video, please do drop a comment below. And if you're stuck, feel free to get in touch with us and we'll sort out your app in no time at our agency. We work with Bubble apps all day, every day. Once again, thank you for subscribing to the channel. Bye.